Wow. We are all familiar with incredible stories of startups. We talk about their growth, their innovation, some crazy lifestyles. Today, I don't want to discuss about their muscles, but I want to discuss about what truly makes them unique. Is their people and the mindset in order to build a startup. In this episode, I will be discussing work culture in startups, lean startup, this philosophy behind continuous experimentation. But I cannot do it alone. I have invited a special guest today that has been in the startup world since the dot-com bubble. So he has almost never worked in a big corporation, completely formatted and groomed inside of the startup world. Today I have Andres Glusman, who, by the way, so he has been in several startups. He has been working for Meetup. So Meetup, he was like kind of one of the early employees, and then he became, like, correct me if I'm wrong, the chief product officer, some strategy vice president, all these fancy titles, he got them. And he has been even living the period where Meetup was acquired by WeWork. Sad story, but it happened. He has been driving growth through experimentation since the 90s. He has been working also for Yahoo. He founded also a company called iTraffic. And by the way, I think that through iTraffic, you ended up in Meetup. That's what it sounds to me.
So I joined a company called iTraffic, which was founded by a guy named Scott Heiferman. And Scott was the founder of Meetup, and he invited me to be a part of it. So that's my connection to Meetup. But
okay. So Andres, I'm so glad to have you here, because for me it's going to be like a learning journey. So we were talking about this innovation and what makes, in fact, to have this mindset of creativity, continuous experimentation. And then I was thinking about my corporate life. We were always fighting about recreating this spirit of experimentation. We went into using the concept of lean startup that was initiated in the tech world and has been explored by different big corporations, some cases with success, some cases like disaster. And I wanted to understand, Andres, what do you think, can this methodology also be used to create like a good working culture beyond just the simple innovation? Can it be used by people in order to create this mindset of having better cultures?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for having me. It's 100% true. So I did help launch Meetup. I made their first $14 of revenue. I had almost every single job you can have, but usually focused on product and growth and strategy. And as a result, we were in a position, I was personally in a position where I got to experiment a lot with different ideas, refining from previous lessons learned at other startups. And we were early pioneers in the lean startup movement. So I do have a lot of experience in what makes the lean startup special. Why did I get so excited about it? Why did I get up on stage and be on conferences, the Lean Startup Conference, and talking about it every chance I got? It's because it is one of the most important ways of separating out kind of guessing from doing things that make progress. And the big idea behind anything with regard to lean is sort of this humility, or having a keen understanding that when you're creating, when you're building, more than anything, you're just guessing. And building is hard. And when you're guessing, you're going to guess wrong a lot. And ultimately, what you're just doing when you're guessing, which sounds not business-like, that sounds unscientific, is you're making assumptions about what you think is the reality of the world and what ultimately will drive an outcome you want. And the lean startup methodology is really one around, there's lots of different ways of framing it, but the way that I really like to think about it is that it's about having the humility to understand that you're making assumptions and to approach the work you do knowing that you're making assumptions and therefore trying to figure out how accurate are my assumptions. And so what I always love to say when I was at Meetup is that our biggest competitor was, in fact, or the biggest thing that was going to make us potentially fail was not a competitor. It was that we would hire very smart people and that they would make logical decisions based on faulty assumptions. Smart people, logical decisions, faulty assumptions. And ultimately, you're going to end up at a place where you've wasted a ton of time and money and energy when you do that, because you've done everything right except for that you made a bet on something that's fundamentally unsound. And so as the lean startup is applied to culture building, is really one of sort of saying, well, how does one work together with your colleagues to make it so that you are in fact hiring smart people and you're encouraging them to make logical decisions, but make it so that the assumptions are not flawed. Make it so that the assumptions are more likely to be true. And that's what I did by virtue of running a lot of experiments at Meetup or gathering data in lots of different ways. Having things approached in an iterative cycle is really about sort of getting loops in. It's why my current company, Do What Works, why we acquire, or why we're focused on helping people understand and learn from the experiments that other companies run in order to put them in a position where they're not just making guesses and where they're actually more likely to be making logical decisions on accurate assumptions, which leads to the outcomes they want. And that's ultimately what we're all here for. Yes, there's like weird politics in certain organizations and weird backbiting and for not the best of reasons in some organizations, but I do generally believe that people want fulfilling work and they want fulfilling culture and fulfilling environment. And usually that stems from winning. And the best way to win is by making logical decisions on well-grounded assumptions. And that's really kind of what my career has been all about. That's what my mindset's about. And that's what I've seen work in the cultures that I've been a part of, where we really were doing great. And I've seen it. There have been times in cultures and companies where I've worked at where we weren't doing great. And it's mostly because we were making good decisions on bad assumptions.
Andres, so what I have to highlight, and because you made me think about the journey in my previous experience in the corporate world. And yes, we learned the lean methodology, but the two pillars that you mentioned, this humility and collaboration, is kind of a meta skill or a practice that was not developed. So you cannot have collaboration if still there is a lot of politics going around. If the old guys who are transitioning from the change have the same mentality, the same mindset, and they believe that what they have in their minds is the absolute truth that needs to be scaled down to the organization, or when we believe that our products are awesome and there is no way that there could be a flaw. If you're selling the best drink in the world, you cannot change it. You shouldn't be changing. So there is no questioning, because you as a leader will have the absolute truth. And these are two things that you made me think that were missing in the transition. And that's why it took a long, long time to deploy this lean startup philosophy across the organization, because the resistance was not coming from the bottom of the organization, was coming from the top. And that's something that breaks any culture, because behind this lean startup is not about the methodology as such. It's about the agility, the process that you have created, that it is embedded in every single step in that you take inside of the company. Love that.
That's right. And look, the leadership of companies generally becomes leaders because they've got a lot of experience, because they've gotten a lot of knowledge, because they've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And so they're drawing from a wealth of experience that help them make assumptions, that help them make logical decisions. What often happens is that the world changes, or what they're approaching. If you're just repeating what you did before, if it's a question of saying, we are in this specific market and every other market looks a lot like this one, we just have to do X, Y, and Z over and over again and we'll win, then that's a great approach to take. If what you're entering into, if the challenge you're taking on generally requires a fair amount of uncertainty, then your past experience is only going to be so helpful. And that's probably what was tripping up those leaders in that regard, is that they were probably very focused either on scale or on repeating things that they know worked, past tense, and they got tripped up by the things that you needed to do now, current tense, in order to make it work going forward based on the changing market conditions or the new market you're going into. So I generally like to think of it as people are generally, I like to be optimistic and think that people aren't doing it to be jerks. People aren't doing it to be boneheaded. I think they're all making very logical decisions, and they're just maybe looking at the wrong problem, or they're sort of thinking the problem is one way when it's actually different. And so there's times when the lean startup methodology, by the way, is just like absolutely the wrong thing to be approaching an organization with. It's a great methodology for very quickly honing in on truth in an uncertain environment. If you have a great deal of certainty, then what you really need is to just go foot to the floor, accelerate, go, and grab as much, repeat the thing as often as possible and be really good at being efficient. But if what you need is to be effective, which is sort of to figure out what you need to work on, then that's when a methodology like this is more useful.
Today, the level of uncertainty about the future is higher than ever. So a lot of big corporations are trying to survive in order to adapt to maybe needs of customers, maybe, I don't know, being disrupted by a small company that can do things better. And it seems to me that this, then I will call it philosophy of lean startup, becomes a little bit more a need. But today, and I remember that a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I got a report that approximately only 20% of big corporations has been establishing some type of agile methodology in order to go faster. But 20%, that's peanuts. So when it is today that they need to embrace this type of change, does it mean that you need to have that their senior management should have like a certain archetype of mindset in order to embrace change and decide to embrace the linear startup methodology? Or how would you see that?
Fascinating question. It's surprising that you would have 80% of organizations choosing some sort of a waterfall
Indeed.
mindset. Yeah. Yeah, usually waterfall mindsets are associated with large-scale project management, where we have a lot of moving pieces, and they need to be sequenced in a certain order. But it's very hard to correct. I mean, if you look at, I'm speaking a little out of turn, but from what I understand, even about like the fashion industry, for example, where you order products, several seasons ahead of time. But the disruption that was H&M, that was some of these companies, is the ability to go very quickly, see what's hitting the market now, and make things in smaller batches quickly and deliver them very quickly to get to respond to market conditions and to be adaptive. And so it's generally going to be the case that organizations that are agile are going to be able to respond to rapidly changing conditions more quickly.
Yeah.
They might not be as effective. I guess I'm trying to figure out why would you possibly argue the other side? What would be the steel man for the other side? It would just be that you have a massive operational logistical challenge that you need to move forward with, and therefore you need to sequence it out in a certain way. But you're right. In this day and age, the ground conditions are changing so quickly that you need to have a bit of a sense and response systems on the ground.
But I guess there is a little bit of like a psychological reason, is that we are not, in most of the cases, we are a little bit resistant to big changes. And for us, it's a little bit better to be in an environment that gives us the illusion of control. When you say that next 2024 budget, I'm going to prepare it now, and it's going to be that exactly. And this is the type of activities that we will do. It gives us like the satisfaction, like, yeah, we know what is going to happen. But in reality, we don't have any control of the future. But that's the psychological satisfaction that we get. And still now, we are going to say that senior management has been probably those type of positions for 20 years, and it's difficult to change. It's almost like you have been already formatted. And if you come with a methodology where you say, I might have this type of features for a new service, but I don't know what is going to be the end result. So they still prefer to do this project management approach where you write 20 pages to describe the solution for an implementation that you will do within 8 months or 12 months, but it gives them a little bit the satisfaction of, I know how much I'm going to spend. And they care less about the outcome, which is one of the benefits of the linear startup, is to know to slowly validate outcomes with the real users so that there is lower chance of failing, right?
That's right. Well, one approach you can take there in that situation is to have a bit more of a portfolio approach, a portfolio of different initiatives. So, for example, if you run a subscription company, if you have a subscription-based service, you have a pretty good sense as to what your subscription revenue is going to be next month based on the last 9 months or 12 months of subscription revenue on renewals. And then you've got a sense of maybe around, if you spend this much money, you're going to get around this much money from new customers, as an example. So those are pretty much like known entities, and they're sort of around a boundary of like, how much better can I get, or how much worse would it get based on your known entities around an initiative that's kind of established. If you have something that's brand new, a seedling, then what you need to, your ability to forecast, your ability to see the future becomes extremely opaque. It's very foggy, and it's very hard to know what kind of impact you can have. And so essentially inside of certain organizations, what you really need is a portfolio of bets that are kind of coming into maturity at certain times. So ideally you have those bets that are established, that are driving the lion's share of your revenue, that continue month in, month out to deliver reliable, predictable revenue that you can use to pay your employees, pay your suppliers, reward your shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the roster of the new things that are coming that are extremely unpredictable. And that's really what you want to think about, is like kind of larger, bigger bets that are more out there, that have less certainty. And there, your mindset or what you can predict from them is different, and your goals for them have to be different as well.
Indeed. Andres, let me get a little bit more personal with you. I want to understand, is it because of your mindset as entrepreneur, or as the way of looking at things around the world has been formatted, that has made you never consider to work for a big corporation? You have been, you made your life in the startup world. Have you considered ever to go and work for a big corporation?
It's a funny question. So as it turns out, it's probably buried deep in my LinkedIn, but I started my career at the Boeing Corporation.
Yeah.
And I went there because I was a kid of scientists. My parents were scientists, and I wanted to learn about business. And I thought, what better place to learn about business than one of the world's largest corporations? So I went to Boeing and I joined them, and I did learn a lot, but it was a very slow moving organization for me. And it was the wrong kind of organization for me at the time. So the funny thing is, I said to my boss, like, how is it that we stay in business? This is so slow moving. And he said, oh, well, you should look at our competition. Right. So if you just see what our competitors are doing, we move a lot faster than they do at that time. It was a different time and era, and it's a different kind of thing for me. So I happened to leave at the birth of the internet in order to go pursue and play around with what I was working on. But actually, like, I worked at Yahoo in the early 2000s. I did a summer internship there when I was in business school. And it was when they were just starting to get reborn and having a really interesting ride coming out of the dot-com explosion. There was a period of time where they were really doing some interesting stuff. And I worked there, and it was fascinating. I thought it was really cool. And I think it's all about trade-offs, Ivan. It's all about trade-offs. And so, large corporations have the advantage to whatever impact you're going to do, whatever you do delivers that impact at a massive scale. And so, a 1%, a 3%, a 5% improvement in something at $1 billion scale is a huge amount of impact when you're affecting billions of people in some regards. In as a result, they have to move kind of a little bit more. There's a lot more moving pieces. It's slower to move. So it's historically been less for me, in part because I tend to be in places where it rewards a lot of entrepreneurial creativity and a lot of entrepreneurial drive, and you have the ability to move very quickly and kind of bring new products to market, which tends to be entrepreneurial areas. So long-winded answer, Ivan. I'm not against big companies. I'm certainly not. I'm not looking for them right now. I would never be
Absolutely
looking
not.
for them. And my goal is to eventually just work from a beach. Work remotely as much as I possibly can, and in the distant future. But no, it's a really different kind of challenge. And I just think that people are good and people are trying their best to make the maximum impact they can. And in a larger organization, you're going to do whatever. You're going to be in an environment where, in exchange for moving more pieces, having more moving pieces, you're going to make bigger impact. And it might take a little bit longer, but you might make a pretty substantial impact. In a startup, you can get to the spot where you're going to be there. But look, my goal is to do what works, have the impact of a major corporation too. So, every entrepreneur who says that they're against big companies is sort of like, well, what is it you want your company to be at the end of the day?
I get it. So you have been working in startups at different stages of development. Some of them were at early stage, some of them were already in the full growth stage. What are the biggest challenges that startups have when they scale up? How can they do it so that they keep the soul of the beginning when it was a small group, the pizza stories and all the stuff? And then suddenly there is thousands of people joining, and some of them are going to be dispersed in several parts of the world. What are the challenges that you have observed?
Yeah. So if you're lucky, your startup will go through a journey, and there's the time in a venture where you're in figure it out mode. We got to figure out what this thing is, what people want, what's the basics, how does this work? And most companies will fail at that point. So you're in figure it out mode. And then once you figured it out, quote unquote, then you're in a spot where you're in let's do more of it mode, grow mode. And that's what you're really talking about. And when you start to grow, it's what happens when an organization moves from, I think you referenced 2 pizza teams, but it goes from 11 people. There's a sort of phase shift when you get into the 20, 25. Suddenly there's a coordination challenge around 50 to 75. There's a big one at like 120-ish. It's even bigger. You stop knowing everyone's name. And then at that point, you start having multiple organizations that are moving parts. There's a lot more layering and coordination. More and more of the effort goes into just keeping the moving parts aligned, more so than you can pull off when it's so informal. And then you also start to have lots of competing interests and competing priorities, which is often what people call politics in some regards, but more often than not, it's just that you have just different alignment of priorities with different kinds of organizations where everyone's doing their best to solve something as best as they possibly can. But they're going to bump into each other because they're not solving the clarity of the purpose, the clarity of the problem you're solving becomes a little bit harder to align.
So when is the moment that you feel like a CEO of a startup should start really worrying about keeping the culture of the organization? Is it across all the stages, or is there like a critical stage where if you don't take care of it, it breaks?
From personal experience, it's at every single stage. It's at every stage, right? So Tony Hsieh was an investor at Meetup. He was sort of famous for starting a company that did extremely well called Link Exchange. He started in the 90s, and it did extremely well. And he didn't really pay attention to culture. It was really about like, let's grow, and didn't pay a lot of attention to culture. He said that at a certain point, he just hated coming to work at his own company. He just could not stand the idea of it. And it was just sort of out of control. And he made that a huge point when starting Zappos. No, he didn't start Zappos, when taking over Zappos and growing Zappos, to really make sure that culture was front and center and was an essential part of what they worked on. And in many regards, that is the CEO's job. There's a lot of people who are responsible for culture, but the buck stops there, and culture defines everything. So it's the CEO's job on day one when there's one or two people, and it's, you know, the CEO's job on the day they go public and beyond when they're huge and there's tons of people. It's always the CEO's job.
If you had the opportunity to give an advice to a CEO of a big corporation regarding work culture, if they had to learn something out of the startup world regarding this culture of innovation, this agility, what advice would you give them regarding something positive, and also what advice would you give them regarding something that is negative in the startups that they shouldn't be doing in the big corporations?
Yeah. Well, I mean, from my personal experience, and I haven't run I haven't run a company, a publicly traded company, a Fortune 500 company. So from the experience that I have that I could offer, it's really around a keen understanding of that equation I was talking about earlier, that you're hiring smart people who are going to make logical decisions based on assumptions. And are they making them based on faulty assumptions or validated assumptions? And how the quickest path you can possibly get to validating your assumptions is what's going to separate successful teams inside the corporation, successful divisions of the corporation, successful corporations from their competitors in the long haul. And so it's being a laser focus on that. And in particular, there's sort of two questions I like to ask, which is what has to break in your favor in order for this to work? And then what's the fastest way you can figure out whether that something's going to break in your favor? So those two questions repeated over and over again can cascade all the way down from a board, all the way to the C-level, to the different levels of middle management, all the way down to the people on the front lines. Every single job, every single challenge, every single project generally is going to be defined by that question. What has to break in your favor in order for the project to work? What's the fastest way to figure out if those things are going to break in your favor?
Everything is all about reducing the risk of failure. That's a constant in the startup world. Unfortunately, it's like when you're in a big corporation, you don't think that you will ever fail. Nevertheless, that happens. And I think it's going to happen more often than not. I mean, I mentioned to you just before that I grew up in Switzerland. So a bank like Credit Suisse going to hell just in a couple of days, that was unthinkable. And that is going to happen more and more often. This concept of reducing the risk of failure is something that there is different names for that, but let's call it like test and validate what works, which is, by the way, what you do in your company, do what works. Can this philosophy of continuous experimentation be the secret to create like successful, productive work cultures? This Kaizen approach. I know that you may not like the word Kaizen, but this continuous experimentation, iterations about I have data, it works or not, and then if it doesn't, then the hell out.
Yeah, no, this notion of continuous improvement, continuous iteration, continuous feedback loops, and getting better at whatever you're working on, there's no doubt about it. It's also, look, it's either, from my point of view, it creates a more rewarding environment, which you ultimately want to be a part of. If you're constantly just doing the exact same thing over and over again in the exact same way, it's not so interesting. If you're able to gather data and make things better, well, then that feels like you're making progress. And I just generally believe that the feeling of making progress is fundamental to people being motivated to do anything. So if you, like, the feeling of just making a little bit of progress every single day is a huge impact on one's desire or morale or desire to make a contribution, like to keep contributing in general. And so I do feel like it's absolutely fundamental to it. And it's again, one of those things where it's so interesting because, you know, in larger corporations, yeah, people are generally, there's more experience, there's more of a track record. You've got a more established framework and you have a lot more data about how things have worked in the past. And that gives you a lot of opportunity to leverage. And of course, there's abilities to innovate on top of it and grow. And that's the only way you can really grow at a certain point. And aside from just going out and buying a new thing, You're either you're going to start something new, you're going to build something new, or you're going to make your current thing better, more efficient. And so if you're going to make it more efficient or more effective, that's going to come from that continuous improvement cycles that are going to come through. I can't see that not being the way to like creating a fulfilling and enjoyable workplace. So that's what I would generally coach for. Try to remember back to your question. What was the original question too? It was related to, as I was on a rant there, I got lost in my own rant.
So if can the philosophy of continuous experimentation be the secret to successful work cultures?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because the continuous experimentation as applied to developing work cultures, generally to me, the most successful work culture is a culture where people feel like they're driving momentum. And they're having a sense of momentum and things are positive and moving forward. And winning teams tend to have a much more robust and interesting environment. Like good things are happening there. Yeah. It's when things start to fail that all of the cracks start to show, all of the challenges start to become much more material, and you're sort of it's harder to get things done. And so yes, the things that ultimately continuous innovation, continuous experimentation is the anecdote to the fact that most things are constantly devolving, or constantly in a state of decay or expiring or getting worse, and they need to be maintained. And if you're not maintaining something, it's getting worse. And the alternative is if you can maintain it and then innovate on top of it, it's going to get better. And so you have to not only the continuous improvement when it comes to culture building stems from either things that you're doing directly to experiment on the culture improvement or on the larger outcome that generally fuels a more robust and exciting and vibrant work culture.
One of the things that you make me think, because you mentioned about the failing, it is about that one of the biggest frictions in big corporation is that the acceptance of failure. So when you fail, in fact, you are blamed. You will be pointed out. It is your fault. You didn't do it correctly. While in agile organizations, I would say that failure is, as long as there is a learning, so you swallow it because it's part of the uncertainty that there is around the world. But at least you tried. You did something. Innovation cannot come from doing something the same all over again. So. And this is very difficult for big organizations to accept that there is one moment that you need to show data. And maybe that's one of the reasons why certain programs on lean startup or full transformation through agile approaches fail, is because they cannot be sincere about the data. Because you can play around with data and show something positive and then move it to the next stage, despite the fact that it was a real failure. There was no clear KPI that showed that it is that is a failure. So do you have the same in the startup world? Do you play around sometimes about failure, or is it more acceptable that if somebody from your team tells you, no, it didn't work, whatever was working for 1 or 2 months, or would you be able to accept it in an easy manner? And what could be the conditions for acceptance?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's going to sound sacrilegious, but even in the lean environment, nobody likes to fail.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to fail. Nobody wants to celebrate failure. It's a thing that occurs. It's an outcome that occurs. And when you're running experiments, it's an outcome that occurs a lot. When you're innovating, it occurs even more. When you're trying to change behavior, it occurs a lot. What the framework I believe that one needs to have is not sort of saying that we accept failure. It's a framework that says we understand that framework is going to happen a lot. And so, as an example, on Optimizely, a platform that makes it easy for people to run experiments, 80% of experiments that are run on their platform do not positively move the needle. 8 out of 10. So 8 out of 10 months that were spent building things are producing no results. I don't think anyone would be excited about being like, yeah, we won 2 out of 10 times. Now, what do you need to do? Why is it okay in certain environments? Is one, it's like you need to understand that that's the level, that's the playing field you're playing in to begin with. Whether you run it as an experiment, whether you run it as pre-post, whatever change you're making, if those are your odds, those are your odds. The rational thing to do when you have odds like that are kind of twofold. One, how do you very quickly make it so that your failures are very inexpensive? If you look at the startup ecosystem, most startups fail, and ideally they're going to fail when they only have $1 million check, or small checks, as opposed to when they're at the 70, 100, $80 million phase, where they're getting these big checks and they're failing. Well, that's a lot worse outcome. But in a smart startup environment, you're dealing with small outcomes or small bets. So ideally, you want to be failing and have the consequences of your failures be very small. And then the second thing is you want to work like hell to make it so that you're not only winning 2 out of 10 times. Shoot, if you can win 3 out of 10 times, you're doing 50% better. If you're doing 4 out of 10 times, you've now doubled your hit rate. And so how do you design a system? How do you design an environment? How do you design routines, reward systems that motivate you to get better at improving that win rate? And if you don't start by acknowledging the win rate, if you don't understand that you're playing a game that is really stacked against you, where you're going to lose 2 out of 10 times, unless you can make these systematic improvements, unless you can find ways of improving your win rate, then you're going to be miserable and you're going to basically get fired because you're going to set the wrong expectations. If you set the right expectations, make it so that your downside risk is as small as possible and your upside benefits from being right are very high, well, then you as long as you can get enough trials in, you'll be fine. And that's essentially why we exist. We exist because we're saying, well, if you can learn from everyone else, you can improve your win rate from 2 out of 10 to do considerably better than 2 out of 10 if you're learning from other people. What's the cost of running a bad experiment? Well, if you can figure out how to shorten your cycle of running it, or as somebody said to me the other day, the best experiment sometimes is the one you didn't run. Is if you can learn from somebody else and not recreate their mistake, well, then you've just embraced their failure. But I don't think, and I'm certainly not in a position where I'm saying, oh, it's great to fail. It's not great to fail. It sucks to fail. Nobody likes it. Nobody likes being rejected on a sales call, whatever the case may be. So it's always about improving your win rate and reducing the cost of being wrong.
Coming back to the fact that you have used as an example your company, Do What Works. So what you're saying to me is that Do What Works looks at what others have done in order to reduce the risk of failure with mainly marketing campaigns. Is that correct, Andres?
We serve the growth teams, the marketing teams, product teams at major corporations, 6 of the top streaming brands, major B2B SaaS companies, major banks, et cetera, direct-to-consumer healthcare companies. They're all running experiments. And the steady state, the industry, the norm is that they're going to lose 2 out of 10 times. They're going to win 2 out of 10 times. They're going to lose 8 out of 10 times.
Yeah.
And they come to us because they want to learn from others so that they don't have to recreate their failed experiments and instead learn from them to leverage the things that are working, stop doing the things or don't try the things that don't work, and focus their resources on the things that are much more likely to win. So that's what we're all about. And that's in the context of marketing. There's really no reason to believe that it's not going to also be true for other kinds of experiments that are being run elsewhere, though. I think in general, it's very hard to win. It's very hard to change behavior. It's very hard to innovate. And so as much as possible, whatever you can do to improve your win rate is probably the most profound impact you can have, second only to reducing the downside cost of being wrong.
What I like, Andres, is it is the ultimate growth hacking tool because you get to learn from real data, not like just from a concept or a guy in a YouTube video who will tell you these are the 3 things that you must do, and then in which conditions.
I watch those, Ivan. I watch those. I see people on LinkedIn giving advice on landing pages, and they're just wrong so often because they're just not data backed. It's not based on data. It's just based on gut, and they say it with a lot of confidence. And it's really criminal. That you really shouldn't be allowed to do that. It is what it is. But no, it's the difference is that's how you end up losing 80% of the time, as opposed to using data at the outset to make better decisions.
Funny thing, Andres, this is super personal. Like what I'm going to tell you is that I have a friend like 2 years ago, he was telling me a little bit like kind of what you do at Do What Works. He wanted to do it. He's also in the tech world and all the stuff. But he decided at the end to don't do his entrepreneurial journey. But he was trying to explain me this idea, and he was like kind of what you have achieved. That's incredible. I have to tell him, by the way, to go and check your. Maybe that will encourage him to go entrepreneur finally. Yeah, still. Anyways, I wanted to go back to somebody that you have mentioned just before, Tony Hsieh from Zappos. So he's one of the most famous guy in the startup world, but not because of his business as such, because, for instance, Zappos is not super well known in Europe or even in the Middle East, but more about this story about creating a culture of delivering happiness. So you mentioned that before he had his own startup and the culture was shit. Then he decided to become like a kind of a VC guy. And then he invested in Zappos, and then he took over the reins of Zappos. So this concept of delivering happiness was like, the hell is like the example in the human resources world about how you should be building great cultures, because it was like saying, what do we need to build in terms of rituals, behaviors, encourage behaviors, mindset in the company to make like people are happy to work with me, even though they are not paid like amazingly better than the competition. Have you heard about other startup founders who are kind of going to this direction of redefining work culture, being good examples of great work cultures?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Tony was very special in that regard, and that everything he did was extremely deliberate with regard to the work culture. And they relocated their company from California to Las Vegas, in part because they knew they would find a lot of people who worked in the hospitality industry, and that was the kind of person that they would reinforce. And they invested a lot into training and a lot into developing of people and reinforcing cultures. I will say my last company, Meetup, was an amazing culture, and I'll give tons of credit to the CEO and actually the CFO, who was also in charge of people, for just being absolutely deliberate on the kind of place we wanted to build and enforcing it by making hard decisions all along the way and getting rid of people when they were the wrong fit for that kind of an environment, when there was wrong behaviors, very, very quickly nipping behaviors in the bud that can easily manifest, and instead being very transparent, very open and honest, and being willing to disagree, but being kind and being really, really great about the kind of place we want to build. We also built a place that was able to recruit people who were extremely talented, who the market wasn't serving well. And so we had a culture in New York in technology that was extremely attractive to certain communities. Our leadership team was 50% women. Our engineering team was the leadership of it was predominantly women as well. And it made an environment in a place where there's a lot of tech bros that people who were really great engineers who said, I really want to work in a place that doesn't have that kind of a bro-y culture. It gave us the ability to hire world-class talent and have a leg up because they wanted to be around a certain kind of person. And it ultimately wasn't just sort of like we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. It was actually extremely smart business decision that led to getting much higher quality talent than you could possibly get in another environment, in a place where everyone's throwing money and kombucha and stock options and various other like perks and benefits to everyone. They had the right to choose where they want to go, and we earned the right to be the place that they chose to go to.
I still remember that story, and I don't know if it is a legend that somebody invented or it really happened, that in Zappos, people were like, after 3 months, they were offered the choice of get a check to leave the company if they believed that they were not the right fit. That was like, do you think that was true, by the way, Andres?
It's definitely true.
Holy.
There's 100% true. Yeah, it's a smart business decision in that it gets rid of people who are the wrong fit very quickly.
Andres, what is the type of work culture that you are developing in your company, in Do What Works?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's much, much harder for our company, in part because we've been a distributed company since day one. And so there's a lot around being around people, around having an office that creates a certain vibe. In a distributed culture, it's something that's much more difficult to figure out how to do. Ultimately, I think the culture generally flows from the founders and then the people you hire and the way in which you engage and what you prioritize. I won't claim that we've cracked the code. I think we're learning how to create a culture in a distributed environment with team meetings and making time for people to engage and to get to know each other. We value a lot what my co-founder and I tend to value, and what I think the kinds of people we've attracted to the company and the leaders in the company that we've attracted value, which is we value innovation. We value truth seeking. We value being kind. We value being open and honest with people. We value being creative, and we try to celebrate it, reward it as much as possible. It's generally, and we hire people sometimes and it's not the right fit, and they don't stay with the company as a result. It's one of those things where you have to make decisions sometimes to have people not continue to be with you. And it sucks because you made a commitment to them, but you really want to do everything you can to put them in the right position afterwards as much as you can. But that's really how we create culture, is just trying to reward behaviors and reward the kinds of people that are really aligned with what we value, and having clarity on it, and being willing to make the difficult decisions at times, which has been few and far between, but it has happened, where we parted ways with folks because it just wasn't the right fit in that regard.
How do you reward the right behaviors? Like, for instance, you have someone who spends quite a lot of time like getting to know the rest of the team, or who is more collaborative. Is it like a financial reward? Is it like a recognition in front of everybody? How do you reward so that people get to know that, oh, that's the kind of behaviors that I want to see in Do What Works?
Yeah, it's mostly been a function of, one, hiring a certain kind of person and creating opportunities for them to do the kind of work where they can exhibit their behavior and shine. And so we have lots of people who've been promoted 3-4 times inside the organization, started off in one role and evolved and grew and grew and grew and grew and gotten to take on a lot more responsibility in a lot of different ways by doing great work and doing it in a way that just really moves us as a team forward. And everyone knows it. We celebrate them as much as we can. They get promoted, they get improved, the compensation, or all the good things that generally happen along the way. Is mostly been a function of, just reward through project selection, and reward through financial and through recognition. It's huge. And then the inverse is also true, which is that you sort of have to know when people aren't the right fit and move on from them.
So you get rid of people, even though, let's say that I do an amazing job, like I'm an amazing developer, but I have shitty behaviors.
I'll say that I've never been in a position yet at this company where we've had that be the case. It's mostly been a question of somebody having the wrong skill set, or not being able to come in and do the work in the right way for whatever job that they have, has generally been the thing. We've been fortunate in that we have hired effectively, and we have people that are just kind and wonderful people, like really, really nice people. So we don't really have that situation where you've got the superstar who's just a jerk and everyone deals with them because they're so good at doing X, Y, and Z. They probably wouldn't have been hired in the first place. So we've not had that problem yet.
Okay.
We probably will. I mean, at some point, odds are, I would hope that we would address it quickly. And now, being a high performer that ruins your culture, it does not buys you a win today, but costs you a lot tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Andres, we are ended this episode, and it was quite informative in terms of the journey of startups, what we can learn or not from the startups, the mentality, the mindset, this approach of continuous experimentation. And I wanted to ask you, so if somebody wants to reach out to understand more what's the value of your company, who wants to understand how do what works can help them grow faster, growth hack their way through learning from others, instead of, I mean, doing the mistakes, how can they reach out or try or know more about do what works?
Yeah, so they can go to dowhatworks.io.
Yeah,
dowhatworks.io, or they can connect with me on LinkedIn as well. So those are two great resources to be able to learn more. We typically, for our conversion rate optimization product, work with folks in the mid-market and enterprise. And then we have a brand new product that focuses on performance marketing, and that we work with people who are marketers at all stages of company. And so they can get in touch with us if they want to use our technology to be able to get more results from their current spending on their search engine marketing.
That's great, Andres. So I'm going to be putting the links just below. Andres, it was really lovely to meet you. Gracias, muchas gracias.
My pleasure. Very nice to meet you, Ivan.
Thank you, Andres. I was so happy to spend this evening with you. It's my evening, your morning. Take care, Andres.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.